The gravel crunched under the tires of the pristine white SUV, a sound that usually signaled a guest or a delivery. But for Arthur Vance, a 68-year-old retired structural engineer with a penchant for solitude and a deep-seated love for his 30-acre property, that sound meant only one thing: trouble. Arthur lived on the very edge of the Whispering Pines subdivision. When he had purchased the land 40 years ago, it was nothing but dense forest and a winding creek. Over the decades, the city had crept closer, and eventually, a high-end gated community had sprouted up against his eastern border. Through a series of aggressive legal maneuvers and questionable zoning shifts a few years back, his land had been technically annexed into the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. Arthur had fought it, of course, but the lawyers had tucked him into a special district, clause that he'd been ignoring with practiced ease ever since. He sat on his porch, a mug of black coffee in hand, watching through the iron bars of his perimeter gate. Two men stepped out of the SUV. They were dressed in what Arthur called the suburban combat uniform: pressed khakis, polo shirts with the HOA logo stitched over the heart, and clipboards held like shields. "Mr. Vance?" the younger one shouted, his voice cracking slightly in the morning air. This was Brandon, the newly appointed compliance officer. Beside him stood Miller, a man whose primary personality trait was his obsession with the exact height of St. Augustine grass. Arthur didn't move. He didn't even put down his coffee. "Gates locked, boys. Hope you enjoyed the drive." "Arthur, we've discussed this," Miller called out, stepping up to the iron bars. "We have reports of unauthorized agricultural structures and a non-compliant perimeter fence. We need to conduct a site inspection. Open the gate." "No," Arthur said simply. The silence that followed was thick. Brandon looked at Miller, then back at Arthur. "Excuse me? You can't just say no. The bylaws clearly state that the Architectural Review Committee has the right to inspect any property within the association boundaries with 48 hours' notice." "We sent the letter." "I used that letter to start my wood stove," Arthur replied, finally standing up and walking to the edge of the porch. "And I'll say it again, slower this time so it sinks in. No. This is my land. My rules. You're standing on the easement, which is as far as you go." "You're being unreasonable," Miller yelled, his face turning a shade of red that matched the violations folder in his hand. "We have a right to be in there. Your fence is 6 feet high and made of wrought iron. The bylaws specify 4-foot white vinyl, and we've had complaints about a large rusted metal cylinder near your barn. It's an eyesore for the neighbors." Arthur chuckled, a dry, raspy sound. "The rusted cylinder is a vintage grain silo I'm restoring. And the neighbors you're talking about live half a mile away through a dense tree line. They'd need binoculars to see it. Now get off my driveway." The conflict didn't end there. Over the next 2 weeks, the HOA escalated. They sent certified letters. They levied daily fines of $250. And they even tried to send a landscaping crew to remedy the height of his hedges. Arthur had met the landscapers at the gate with a legal injunction and a very large, very calm Doberman named Duke. The landscapers had turned around before the truck even came to a full stop. But the real climax began on a Tuesday morning. Arthur was in his workshop, the smell of sawdust and oil filling the air, when he heard the heavy rumble of machinery. He walked out to find a sheriff's deputy standing by the gate, looking deeply uncomfortable, while Miller, Brandon, and a locksmith stood nearby. A flatbed truck carrying a standardized vinyl fence sat idling in the road. "Morning, Deputy Higgins," Arthur said, leaning against the gatepost. "I assume you're here to tell these gentlemen about the laws regarding trespassing?" The deputy sighed. "Arthur, they've got an order from the board claiming an emergency safety violation. They're saying your unauthorized structures pose a fire hazard to the community. They have a right to abate the nuisance." Miller stepped forward, a smug grin on his face. "Open it, Arthur, or we cut the chain. Once we're inside, we're going to dismantle that eyesore of a silo and replace this barbaric fence. You'll be billed for the labor, of course." Arthur felt a heat rise in his chest, but he kept his voice low. "Miller, you've spent your whole life living in boxes. You want every lawn to be the same, shade of green, and every house to be the same, shade of beige, because you're terrified of anything you can't control. But you don't control me. You don't control this dirt." "Cut it!" Miller snapped at the locksmith. "Wait," Arthur said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a laminated map. "Deputy, before anyone touches my property, I'd like you to look at this. It's the original deed of 1982, combined with the 2024 Geological Survey." The deputy took the map, squinting. Miller scoffed. "We've seen the maps, Arthur." "You're in the district." "I'm in the district," Arthur agreed. "But you're not looking at the soil. You see that blue line? That's an underground tributary of the Elderberry Creek. It runs directly under this gate and across the north side of my property." "So what?" Brandon asked. "So," Arthur smiled, "the state. Environmental protection laws for Class A. Waterways supersede HOA bylaws. Any construction, including the removal of an existing protective barrier like my fence, requires a state-level environmental impact study. If you cut that chain or set foot on that soil with heavy machinery to move that silo, you're not just violating my privacy, you're committing a state environmental felony." Miller's face went from red to a ghostly pale. "You're bluffing." "Call the county surveyor," Arthur invited. "He's a friend of mine. He's the one who helped me file the conservation easement paperwork last Friday. My land is now a protected wildlife corridor. My rules aren't just mine anymore, Miller. They're the state's." The locksmith, sensing the shift in the wind, packed his tools and walked back to his van. "I'm not getting involved in a legal fight with the state," he muttered. The deputy handed the map back to Arthur. "Looks like you've got your ducks in a row, Arthur. Miller, unless you have a state permit signed by the governor, I suggest you get that truck off this man's property. Now." Miller was shaking with rage. "You think you're so smart? You're just a hermit in a rusted-out scrap heap. This community has standards. People pay millions to live here without having to look at your silo." "Then don't look," Arthur said, his voice firm and final. "Plant some taller trees on your side. But don't you ever come back to my gate. I refuse to open it for a reason. This land has a soul. It's not a line item on a budget or a bullet point in a handbook. It's home." Brandon tried one last-ditch effort. "We'll sue. We'll take you to the Supreme Court. I've got plenty of time and plenty of coffee," Arthur replied. "But before you go, you might want to check your SUV. You parked it right over a fire hydrant easement. It'd be a shame if the deputy had to write you a ticket." The deputy didn't even hesitate. He reached for his ticket book. As the SUV peeled away, leaving a cloud of dust in its wake, Arthur watched them go. He felt a hand on his shoulder, or rather a cold nose. Duke had come out to join him. Arthur reached down and scratched the dog behind the ears. He walked back to his porch and sat down. The silence of the woods returned, broken only by the chirping of a cardinal and the distant, rhythmic clink-clink of a wind chime hanging from the barn. The HOA saw a non-compliant property. They saw violations and eyesores. But as Arthur looked out over his rolling hills, the wild grass swaying in the breeze, and the old silo gleaming like a silver sentinel in the sun, he saw something they would never understand. He saw freedom. He had spent his life building things, bridges, skyscrapers, foundations. He knew that if the foundation wasn't solid, the whole structure would eventually crumble. The HOA was built on the shaky ground of conformity and control. His life was built on the bedrock of the earth itself. The sun began to set, casting long golden shadows across the driveway. The gate remained closed, its black iron bars standing strong against the outside world. Arthur took a slow sip of his now cold coffee and smiled. In a world that was constantly trying to pave over everything, unique and fence in the human spirit, he had held his ground. He had protected his little corner of the world. He had refused to let the gray-beige tide wash over his sanctuary. "My land," he whispered to the wind, "my rules." The weeks that followed were remarkably quiet. Word had spread through, whispering pines about the madman on the hill who had outmaneuvered the board. With a map and a Doberman, the daily fines were quietly dropped after Arthur's lawyer sent a formal notice regarding the harassment of a state-protected conservation area. Occasionally, Arthur would see a car slow down as it passed his gate. People would peer through the bars, looking for the eyesore they had heard so much about. What they saw instead was a man tending to a lush, wild garden, a silo that was slowly being transformed into a beautiful guest house with stained glass windows and a perimeter fence that looked less like a barrier and more like a frame for a masterpiece. One evening, a young woman from the subdivision stopped her bicycle by the gate. She didn't have a clipboard. She just looked at the wildflowers growing tall along Arthur's fence line. "It's beautiful," she said when she saw Arthur on the porch. "It's the only place around here that looks real." Arthur stood up and tipped his hat to her. "Thank you, miss. It takes a lot of work to keep things real." "I heard the board is still mad," she laughed. "They say you're a rebel." "I'm just a man who knows where his property line ends and his soul begins," Arthur replied. As she pedaled away, Arthur felt a deep sense of peace. The battle was over, not because he had won a fight, but because he had stayed true to the land. He hadn't just refused to open his gate to officers. He had refused to open his life to their narrow vision of the world. And in that refusal, he had found his greatest victory. The gate stayed shut. The rules stayed his. And for the first time in a long time, the Whispering Pines were actually quiet.